Over the past 700 years, the Marlborough landscape has been highly modified. Some native bird species have become extinct, and others, such as tui, bellbird and keriru, confined to limited bush and forest habitats. A council-driven project called Tui to Town began in 2008. It offers grants for planting native trees to bring the birds back to the region and encourages the public to report bird sightings.
The Tui to Town project came about as a subset to a broader project that is looking at biodiversity in the whole of Marlborough, and essentially the council's required to do some work to try and promote the protection of Indigenous biodiversity. So we've done a lot of work with farmers and a lot of work in identifying sites that remain, and particularly in South Marlborough where there's not a lot left. And I guess that's what really brought us to the Tui to Town, was in some parts of South Marlborough there is virtually nothing left, and so on top of trying to protect what's there, this is the next step, which is trying to rebuild some habitat into areas that are virtually sort of desert as far as Indigenous biodiversity goes. We do know what was here, and like the rest of New Zealand, it was essentially fully forested and has been very highly modified, firstly by early human fires and then by very active drainage of the wetland swamp areas. The Tui to Town project, it's really a citizen science type project where we're encouraging people to actually record tui sightings in this area. What happens is the tui can breed on the North Bank Hills, which have got some good primary forest left, but they don't really live or breed in the South Bank part of the area because there's just no forest habitat left. So what we're trying to do is encourage people to record their sightings of them so that we get a picture of how far across the Waido Plain they come and what they're feeding on. And then we also have some funding incentives to do plantings. The planting project only funds natives because it's an Indigenous sort of biodiversity based habitat program where we're trying to promote the restoration of some natural Indigenous habitat, but in saying that we certainly acknowledge that the birds use non-native trees and the sightings that people have been reporting in confirm that. Some of the species that are particularly useful are the winter flowering eucalyptus because they just seem to flower at the right time of year when there's not much else available. And I think about 35% of our sightings are on eucalyptus trees in June-July period. Some of these tree ferns here, Margaret, were quite hard to get going, weren't they?
Yeah,
just because of the moisture.
That one particularly.
Margaret Peace was a bit of an inspiration to us when we started the project because Margaret's been in Marlborough for nearly 40 years and she has worked quite hard to promote the restoration of native habitat. She was a bit of a lonely voice in the early days because it wasn't really mainstream thinking at the time, but Margaret set about planting her own small little patch of forest. So we've been involved with Margaret just using her place as a bit of an example, but also about 10 years ago she decided to organise and lead a landcare restoration project down on Blind Creek, which is just adjacent to her property. So she led a small community group using Outward Bound for the hard labour, and she got about 2 hectares of riparian habitat along the stream planted. So I guess the Tui to Town project's very much about trying to link small areas together. We're never going to get a huge area planted on the Waido Plain, but it's linking small private plantings, some of the council reserve areas and some of these river reserves together. So the birds are actually coming to those now.
Yeah, the small birds like fantails and grey warblers and wax-eyes will be nesting in those trees. The trees. I came here to Marlborough because it has wonderful potential for biodiversity, but in fact over the last 150 to 200 years there has been so much destruction of indigenous vegetation and consequently destruction of native birds and native insects. Over the last 25 years, hundreds of people have been through this area, from young school children up to people 80 years old. I planned it as a teaching site as well as increasing the habitat for birds and insects. It's a very small area, only about 900 square metres. And so it's a very tiny oasis in an otherwise fairly degraded situation.
It's a small sheep, beef farm, only 250 acres off my parents. They had olives and then converted it into a rural lifestyle subdivision. Council run a few articles on Tui Te Town. So when we saw that, our ears really pricked up, and because we did want to plant some more trees, particularly natives as well, to fit into the few forestry trees we've got here. We certainly can choose what we want to put in, but they do have advice on species that help dryland areas. We've done approximately 1,000 trees a year for 4 years. Now we've got a lot more birds than we had, which is really encouraging. Great for the kids to see. So yeah, we've got white-eyes, bellbirds, stuff like that we wouldn't have seen even 2 years ago hanging around. First tui was last year, so 4 years later. So yeah, fantastic, definitely a big improvement.
This program was made with funding from New Zealand On Air.